The fog hung low over San Francisco Bay, damp and metallic, the kind that clung to skin and uniforms alike. In the dim gray light, the cranes of Richmond shipyard number. Two looked like giant skeletons frozen in mid-stride. A shrill whistle broke the morning quiet, bouncing across the corrugated sheds and steel ways. For thousands of workers, it was routine, the start of another punishing shift. For Petty Officer Second Class Sato Kenji, standing under guard with his arms crossed, it was something different. It was a sound he would never forget. A year earlier, he had stood on the deck of a destroyer, convinced Japan's empire could not be stopped. Now he was a prisoner of war, captured after his convoy escort was sunk in the Central Pacific. Brought stateside, he expected humiliation, perhaps hard labor. What he had not expected was this: a shipyard city alive with sparks, smoke, and energy. Through the fog, he saw ribs of half-built ships, steel plates glistening with dew. Welding torches hissed, spitting showers of orange sparks that lit the gloom. The air stank of oil, hot iron, and creosoted timbers. Cranes swung massive, prefabricated blocks like toys, settling them into place with casual precision. Voices shouted across scaffolds, commands in English, bursts of laughter, the bark of foremen keeping the tempo. Sato felt small, like a spectator at some industrial temple. A crowd pressed near the rail. Families of workers and officials gathered for a launch. Flags fluttered, horns moaned from the bay. Then he saw it. A Liberty ship, gray hull towering above the slip, bunting strung across her bow. He had heard rumors of these ugly ducklings. Japanese officers mocked them, welded, crude, slow. But standing beneath her prow, Sato felt no mockery. The ship was immense, blunt, alive with power. The ceremony was quick. A woman in a coat stepped forward and smashed a bottle across the steel. Champagne burst, glass fell, and the hull shuddered. With a groan, the ship slid down the greased ways, the water boiling white as she settled into the bay. Whistles screamed, workers cheered, tugboats nosed in to guide her out. Sato's guard, a stocky sergeant, caught his eye. 30 days, he said with a grin. Keel to water, some even faster. The words struck harder than the noise of the crowd. 30 days. In Japan, such a vessel would have required 6 months of skilled labor, rivets carefully set one by one. Here, women with scarves over their hair, students barely trained, immigrants with thick accents were turning out ocean freighters like loaves from an oven. Among the cheering was a young welder, Helen Carter, her gloves still streaked with soot. She clapped and laughed, proud that part of the deckhouse sliding into the bay bore her welds. For her, it was routine, long shifts, aching shoulders, sparks in her hair. For Sato, it was revelation. The ship's flank bore her name in bold letters, white against gray. Sato's thoughts raced back to Yamamoto's warning before the war. Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. But beyond that, against this, there was no chance. The Empire's merchant fleet had been 6 million tons at the start. Already losses were mounting. And here, the Americans launched replacements in less time than it took his comrades to repair a torpedo hit. The cheering ebbed. Workers drifted back to sheds where new keels already lay waiting. For every hull launched, 2 more were rising. The fog began to lift, revealing cranes, slipways, and scaffolds stretching to the horizon. Sato felt his chest tighten. He had not seen a battle lost. He had seen something worse. The certainty of defeat written in steel and smoke. His guard nudged him forward. Sato walked on silently, boots crunching gravel, the roar of the launch still echoing in his ears. In that moment he understood. The war was over, though Japan had not yet admitted it. The noon whistle screamed again, and the yard emptied like a floodgate had opened. Thousands poured from welding sheds, assembly lines, and drafting offices into the dusty lot where food trucks waited. The clatter of lunch pails and the chatter of voices filled the air, a chorus of exhaustion and determination. Helen Carter pulled off her gloves, shaking sparks from her sleeves, and joined the line at the canteen. She was 22, a welder by necessity, not by birth. A year ago, she had been working in a department store in Oakland. Now she carried a torch hotter than anything she had ever imagined, and spent her nights fusing steel seams on ships meant to carry war across the ocean. She caught sight of the day's bulletin pinned on the board. Across the top in bold type was President Roosevelt's line, clipped from a newspaper. "She may look like an ugly duckling, but she will do." The words had spread like gospel through the yards. The Liberty ships were mocked by some, even within the Navy, but here the phrase carried pride. Ugly or not, they were winning the war one launch at a time. Helen smiled to herself. If this was a duckling, it was the sort that could crush an empire. Not far from the bulletin board, a group of trainees in navy blues sat cross-legged on the ground, eating sandwiches while their officer lectured between bites. Ensign John McKenna had a Boston accent and a habit of using his sandwich as a pointer. He was fresh from officer training, assigned to lead one of the Naval Armed Guard detachments that sailed aboard merchant ships. The men listened as he explained their role: manning the stern gun, keeping watch for submarines, drilling with the 20-millimeter Oerlikons that bristled from the deck. "Remember," McKenna told them, "she's no warship. She's a freighter. But she'll have teeth, and you're the ones to use them." At the edge of the yard, under the watchful eye of guards, Sato observed the scene from his work detail. His mind was still replaying the morning's launch, the thunder of the Liberty sliding into the bay. Now he heard the Americans casually speaking of schedules of the next hulls to be finished. He did not understand every word, but the meaning was clear enough. For them, ships were not rare prizes. They were common, expected, inevitable. That realization burned more than captivity itself. Helen sat on the curb with her lunch tin and looked out over the slips. The skeletal frames of other Liberties rose against the afternoon sky, each at a different stage of completion. Some had keels only days old, a flat spine of steel on wooden blocks. Others already towered with superstructures in place, cranes lowering deckhouses like building blocks. She knew the numbers as well as anyone. The first Liberty, the Patrick Henry, had taken 244 days to build in 1941. Now her yard was averaging a month, sometimes less. At Portland and Baltimore, they were nearly as fast. It was a rhythm of welding arcs, hammer strikes, and cranes swinging overhead, a kind of music that never stopped. McKenna's men finished their lunch and rose to practice. They moved with clumsy energy, drilling the motion of loading shells into a practice breach. He barked corrections, patient but firm. The Liberty would never match a cruiser for firepower, but she was armed enough to fight back. Every ship carried at least a 4-inch gun on the stern and a scattering of anti-aircraft mounts. With his detachment aboard, McKenna knew even a slow freighter could put up a fight. Sato's gaze shifted between the laughing workers and the drilling sailors. The contradiction struck him hard. Women, some barely older than children, were welding the very steel that his Navy would have to face. Men barely trained were preparing to defend cargo ships with guns large enough to cripple a submarine. This was not the professional Navy he had been taught to fear. It was something larger, something stranger. It was a nation at war, every hand committed. When the afternoon whistle blew, Helen returned to her welding torch. She slid her mask down and ignited the flame, the roar filling her ears, the arc blazing white against the seam. Sparks cascaded to the floor as she steadied her hand. Each pass fused another line of steel, another piece of the ship's skeleton. She thought of her brother in uniform serving somewhere in the Pacific. Every weld was for him, for victory, for the promise that he would come home. At dusk, the floodlights flickered on, painting the yard in a harsh glow. The cranes kept moving, the sparks kept flying, the music of industry rising into the night. From the rail, Sato felt the weight of it pressing down. He remembered the laughter of his officers mocking these ships as ugly ducklings. He understood now the irony. The ducklings were multiplying faster than wolves could eat. The whistle blew once more, and the workers trudged home through the fog, weary but resolute. The slips behind them glowed with the shells of tomorrow's ships. For Helen, it was another day's work. For McKenna, another day's drill. For Sato, another step in realizing what no officer in Tokyo would yet admit. On the far side of the Pacific, where the autumn nights grew long and cold, Admiral Nagano Osami sat at a broad desk in Tokyo. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and the faint mildew of old maps. Piles of dispatches lay before him, reports from convoy commanders and fleet officers. He rubbed his temples as he scanned the figures. Merchant tonnage lost. Another 120,000 tons this month. Tankers torpedoed, freighters gone, raw materials never reaching the home islands. His pencil tapped against the table, each stroke an unspoken curse. Nagano had not been blind to this possibility. He remembered clearly the words of Admiral Yamamoto, spoken before the war began. Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, against American industry, no hope. At the time, many had dismissed Yamamoto's warning as pessimism. Now, with the third year of war looming, the numbers told the story. America was building merchant ships faster than Japan could sink them. In the corridors outside, staff officers whispered. They knew the reality, though few dared voice it aloud. Japan had entered the war with roughly 6 million gross tons of merchant shipping. Since then, the fleet had been stretched across 2 oceans, supplying garrisons on scattered islands while trying to feed the homeland. Nearly 2 million tons had already been lost. Submarine reports spoke of wolf packs in the Central Pacific, silent killers that never seemed to run out of torpedoes. One report on Nagano's desk came from a convoy commander who had limped back to Yokohama. His convoy had been reduced to half strength by American submarines. Worse still, his sailors spoke of rumors that in the United States, new ships were sliding into the water in a matter of weeks. Nagano had no confirmation, but the idea was terrifying. If it were true, the balance was already beyond recovery. In the alleys of Tokyo, the consequences were visible. Housewives queued in the chill of dawn for rice and kerosene, clutching ration cards that yielded less each month. Students wore patched uniforms. Even officers in Nagano's own staff were forced to cut back on travel as fuel became precious. Yet the orders from above demanded more convoys, more supplies pushed into the vastness of the Pacific, more sacrifices made with fewer ships. Nagano set aside the reports and walked to the window. The city stretched beneath him, rooftops dim in the evening haze. Somewhere in the dark, children practiced fire drills against the threat of American bombers. He wondered if they understood how fragile the lifeline had become. Japan had relied on the sea for its very survival. Rice from Southeast Asia, oil from the Dutch East Indies, steel and rubber shipped across thousands of miles. Without ships, the empire would starve, no matter how bravely its soldiers fought. He thought of the contrast. Japanese shipyards still labored in the old ways, riveted construction requiring careful craftsmanship, months to complete a single hull. American yards, he had heard, were different. Prefabricated sections welded together by untrained hands, cranes dropping whole deckhouses into place. It sounded absurd, almost reckless. Yet the rumors of record launches, ships built in 30 days or less, kept surfacing. If even half of it was true, Japan faced an enemy whose production power was a weapon as lethal as any battleship. That night, Nagano drafted a memorandum to the Naval General Staff. He urged greater attention to convoy protection, the organization of escorts, and the use of air patrols. But he knew the truth. Escorts were scarce, planes fewer still, and fuel scarcer with each passing month. Orders could be written, but they could not summon ships that did not exist. Across the ocean, Petty Officer Sato Kenji, unknown to Nagano, was seeing with his own eyes what the admiral feared. In Richmond, he watched Liberty ships slide into the water as if stamped from a mold. In Tokyo, Nagano relied on second-hand reports and intuition. Yet both men, prisoner and admiral, grasped the same truth. Time was not on Japan's side. Nagano closed the folder and leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams above his office. The war had been sold to the nation as a righteous crusade, a strike that would break Western empires and secure Asia's future. But the arithmetic of steel did not lie. America had begun with more, and every month it widened the gap. Japan was bleeding ships faster than it could build them, and the enemy was launching replacements at a tempo that defied belief. Outside, the city hummed with the forced cheer of parades and speeches, but Nagano felt only weariness. He whispered into the silence, repeating Yamamoto's words as though they were an epitaph. 6 months to run wild, and after that, nothing. The empire had gambled against industry itself, and he feared the reckoning had already begun. The morning sky over Richmond was scrubbed clean by a stiff November wind. The fog burned away to reveal cranes, scaffolds, and a gray hull waiting at the ways. Flags snapped in the cold air, and a brass band warmed its horns, the brassy notes carrying across the yard. Workers in soot-streaked overalls pressed to the railings beside families and city officials. They had gathered for another launch, though this one carried a special weight. Word had spread that the SS Robert E. Peary had set a record, her keel laid only 4 days earlier. Petty Officer Sato Kenji stood under guard at the edge of the crowd. He had seen launches before in Kure, solemn affairs where officials bowed and craftsmen in crisp uniforms watched their months of work glide into the sea. This scene was nothing like that. Here, the air buzzed with casual confidence. Children perched on shoulders waved flags, women in kerchiefs shouted to friends, men laughed over the noise of cranes. It was not reverence but revelry, as if launching a 10,000-ton freighter was no more extraordinary than opening a factory door. At the bow, a woman in a dark coat stepped forward. She lifted a bottle of champagne, swung it hard, and shattered it against the steel prow. Foam and glass rained down, and the chains clanged free. With a groan that vibrated through the ground, the Liberty began to slide. The crowd roared as the gray mass picked up speed, skimming down the greased timbers. A thunderous splash erupted as she hit the bay, water boiling white as tugboats surged to steady her. Sato's guard leaned close, grinning. 4 days, he said. From keel to water. 4 days, 15 hours. The prisoner's eyes widened. He thought he had misheard, but the sergeant repeated the words. 4 days. His stomach twisted. In Japan, a freighter demanded half a year at minimum, months of skilled riveting, endless inspection. Here, ordinary citizens, women who had never set foot in a yard before, students trained in weeks, had summoned an ocean freighter in less time than it took a wound to heal. Among the cheering stood Helen Carter, her gloves still warm from a night shift welding deckhouse panels. She clapped until her palms stung, pride swelling in her chest. She had welded part of this ship, had watched its skeleton grow night by night. To her, the launch was proof that her aching shoulders and sleepless nights mattered. To Sato, it was revelation, a dagger of truth driven deep. Japan's destiny was already sealed. The Liberty rocked gently in the current, her name painted in bold white letters. Reporters scribbled furiously, Photographers snapped flashbulbs, and dignitaries shook hands. Yet even in the midst of celebration, foremen barked orders, whistles shrilled, and workers drifted back to their stations. Another keel already lay waiting, another hull rising behind it. The production line did not pause for applause. Sato closed his eyes, Yamamoto's warning echoing in his memory. 6 months to run wild, then nothing. That 6 months had passed. This ship, born in 4 days, was proof that America had turned war into arithmetic. Each launch was a subtraction from Japan's future, a tide of steel rising faster than any fleet could stem. Helen brushed sparks from her hair and wiped her brow. She thought of her brother in the Marines, somewhere across the Pacific. Every liberty was another promise he would not fight in vain. She smiled as the Peary slid into her berth, another duckling in the endless flock. For Sato, the cheering blurred into a dull roar. The bay stretched wide and gray, crowded with ships, each one a nail in the coffin of the empire he had once served with pride. The guard nudged him forward, but his legs felt heavy. In Richmond that morning he had seen the impossible made ordinary. He had seen a nation turn steel and sweat into destiny. The office calendar in Richmond was crowded with red circles. Each mark represented a launch, sometimes 2 in the same week. The paper looked less like a schedule and more like a battlefield map littered with targets struck in rapid succession. Helen Carter glanced at it one afternoon while waiting for her payslip, shaking her head at the pace. Just a year earlier, the first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, had required 244 days. Now her yard was turning them out in little more than a month. The impossible had become routine. That evening she met her brother Tom at the yard gate. He was home on leave from Guadalcanal, his arm bound in a sling, his uniform worn thin from jungle damp and weeks of fighting. He carried himself with the wariness of a man who had spent too many nights under bombardment, but his eyes brightened when Helen insisted on showing him the shipyard. They walked along the scaffolds as cranes swung overhead, lowering whole sections of deckhouse into place. Sparks rained from torches where women in kerchiefs crouched along seams. Tom paused, his mouth slightly open. "We're bleeding over every hill and tree out there," he said quietly. "And here you're building the ocean itself." Helen smiled but said nothing. She knew the truth of his words. The war he fought and the war she fought were different, yet both were necessary. Without these ships, his rifle and his courage would be stranded on distant islands. With them, he would be supplied, reinforced, and one day returned home. Nearby, Ensign McKenna drilled his Naval Armed Guard detachment. The men sweated under the afternoon sun as they practiced loading and firing a 4-inch gun bolted to the stern of a finished Liberty. Their movements were rough, but McKenna barked encouragement, reminding them that U-boats would give no second chances. The Liberty might be a freighter, but with her armed crew, she could fight. Sato, assigned to a work detail along the perimeter fence, watched the drill through narrowed eyes. The sight unsettled him. Merchant ships in Japan rarely carried such defenses, and here even freighters bore weapons capable of destroying a submarine. He understood enough English to catch McKenna's words: convoy, gunnery, radar, and each term deepened his unease. He thought of Japanese shipyards where each new hull was treated like a treasure, the work of master craftsmen, months of sweat and rivets. Losses at sea were blows from which the empire struggled to recover. And here? He had overheard a foreman joke that America was building more than 100 Liberties a month. That figure seemed absurd, yet the calendar full of red circles told him it was true. The United States could afford to lose ships by the dozens and replace them before Japan had finished patching a single keel. Helen and Tom climbed a scaffold to watch a crane lower another prefabricated block into place. Workers guided it with gloved hands, shouting over the roar of machinery. The block settled perfectly. Another piece of the puzzle, another step toward a ship that would soon be sliding into the bay. Tom shook his head in disbelief. "You'll never run out of ships," he said softly. His words carried both relief and awe. The whistle blew for the end of shift. Workers streamed from the sheds, tired but satisfied, boots crunching against the gravel. Helen walked beside her brother toward the gate, their footsteps echoing with the rhythm of the yard. She thought of the calendar again, each circle a ship that would carry cargo, men, and hope across oceans. Behind the fence, Sato lingered as his guard motioned him on. His gaze swept the yard one last time. The cranes, the scaffolds, the sparks leaping like fireflies into the dusk. He remembered his officers' boasts about Japan's destiny, the invincibility of the Imperial Navy. But those words now felt hollow. Numbers, not slogans, would decide this war. He had seen the numbers painted in steel and smoke, and he could not look away. Tokyo's Naval General Staff headquarters was heavy with smoke, the walls lined with maps of the Pacific and charts dense with arrows. Officers sat stiffly around a long table, their white gloves resting on dispatches that no one wanted to read aloud. Admiral Nagano Osami adjusted his spectacles and tapped the latest report with a weary finger. Merchant shipping lost this month. Another 200,000 tons. Tankers torpedoed, freighters gone, convoys scattered. The silence in the room pressed down like a weight. Japan had entered the war with 6 million gross tons of merchant shipping. By late 1942, nearly a third of that was gone, and every month the losses mounted. The empire's ocean lifeline, once taken for granted, was being strangled. Oil from the Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, bauxite and steel, all of it depended on ships that were now vanishing faster than shipyards could replace them. Nagano gestured for the intelligence officer to continue. The young man cleared his throat, his voice tight. Intercepted reports suggest that American shipyards have reduced their build times drastically. The Liberty ships, they are completing them in weeks. Some accounts speak of less than a month. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. One officer scoffed. Another muttered that the enemy exaggerated. But Nagano did not scoff. He had heard too many similar whispers to dismiss them. He thought of the photographs smuggled out through neutral ports, yards stretching for miles, cranes working night and day, prefabricated sections stacked like children's toys. America had perfected a new kind of war industry, one that did not rely on guild-trained craftsmen, but on ordinary men and women drilled in speed and repetition. The results were staggering. Where Japan celebrated a single launch after half a year of effort, the United States launched dozens in a month. One captain at the table spoke up, his tone defensive. "Our submarines and aircraft are still sinking more than they can build." But even as he said it, his voice faltered. Everyone in the room knew the truth. Losses now outpaced replacements 3-1, sometimes 4. The Empire was eating its fleet alive. Nagano spoke at last, his voice low but firm. "Gentlemen, battles are decided not only by courage or tactics, but by arithmetic. And arithmetic is not in our favor." He tapped the chart again. "Each Liberty launched replaces what we sink. Each month they produce more tonnage than we can destroy in a year. If these reports are accurate, we are not winning the war at sea. We are merely delaying the inevitable." Beyond the headquarters, Tokyo groaned under shortages. Civilians lined up at dawn for rice that grew scarcer each week. Gasoline was rationed even for senior officers, forcing many to travel by bicycle. The fleet itself rationed fuel so strictly that destroyers were laid up at anchor, unable to sortie. Yet across the ocean, the enemy was drowning in abundance. Convoys filled with tanks, planes, and foodstuffs, enough to feed not just their soldiers, but their allies too. In a POW camp thousands of miles away, Sato Kenji overheard guards discussing the same statistics. They spoke with casual certainty about monthly launches, about shipyards working like factories. For Sato, it was confirmation of what he had seen with his own eyes in Richmond. The Americans were not bluffing. Their abundance was real, and it was limitless. Nagano dismissed the meeting, his officers bowing stiffly before filing out. Alone, he remained at the table, staring at the charts. He thought of Yamamoto's warning before the war. 6 months to run wild, then nothing. That grim prophecy now felt less like speculation and more like history unfolding. Japan's warriors fought bravely across the Pacific, but without ships to supply them, courage would rot into starvation. He folded his hands and whispered to the empty room, "The war is not lost at Midway. It is lost in their shipyards." The words carried no drama, only resignation. Outside, the sun was setting over Tokyo, its orange glow spilling across a nation already running out of time. The early morning fog hung low over the Chesapeake, curling around the hulls of a dozen Liberty ships, as if trying to hold them back. Each vessel, a patchwork of prefabricated steel sections welded with mechanical precision, gleamed wetly in the weak sunlight. Crewmen scuttled along the decks, checking lines, inspecting lifeboats, and feeling the vibration of engines that could push 20,000 tons of cargo at 14 knots. Here, amid the lapping water and steel, the magnitude of American industrial power was palpable. Captain William Harper, a civilian turned merchant marine, ran his hands over the wheel of the SS John W. Brown. The ship was one of over 2,700 Liberty ships built by the United States in less than 3 years. He could hardly believe it. A single shipyard in California had launched 30 vessels in 1 month, more than the Japanese Empire had in an entire year. And today, all 30 were in convoy, escorted by a skeleton crew of Navy destroyers. Harper knew the mathematics of survival. 1 torpedo could cripple a vessel, but 10 new ships would replace it before the enemy could blink. The convoy slipped out of port, engines thumping in unison, horns blowing in ceremonial farewell. Harper noticed the nervous tension of his crew. Many were teenagers, plucked from factories, their hands more accustomed to assembly lines than ropes and sails. Yet their training was meticulous. Drills for fire, man overboard, and submarine attack were repeated until muscle memory overrode fear. The Liberty ships might have been ungainly, but they were dependable, resilient, and abundant, a reflection of the industrial might driving them. Radar operators scanned the mist, whispering coordinates into crackling radios. Across the Atlantic, U-boats prowled the same waters, their diesel engines muted to avoid detection. But America's ingenuity had not only created ships, it had created a system. Escort carriers filled the air with planes, depth charges and sonar created an invisible net of protection. Losses occurred, yes, but the ratio was astonishing. On this particular route, the convoy expected 1 ship lost for every 20 that arrived safely in Britain. The impossible statistic was not just survival, it was dominance by sheer numbers. In the engine room, mechanics checked the triple expansion steam engines, each one a masterpiece of mass production. Every bolt, every piston, every boiler adhered to strict tolerances. Unlike Japanese cargo ships, which could take months to repair if damaged, a Liberty could be fixed and returned to the line in days. This redundancy, this endless supply, was the invisible weapon turning the Atlantic into a highway rather than a battlefield. Harper understood it intellectually, but feeling it through the vibration of the hull and the hum of machinery brought a different comprehension. The Americans were fighting a war not only on land and sea, but in steel and labor. Hours later, the first lookout shouted a warning. A periscope sliced through the fog. Harper's stomach tightened. The crew went to stations, depth charges readied, radios transmitting alerts. Yet even as tension gripped the decks, Harper marveled at the numbers. Each ship carried over 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, ammunition, trucks, and food. In a single convoy, the United States delivered more resources than Germany could muster in 2 months. The math was staggering. Courage and tactics mattered, but in the end, survival leaned heavily on volume and organization. The attack came. 2 torpedoes fired, one striking the midsection of a ship at the rear. Flames and smoke rose, but the convoy pressed on. Harper realized that in another time, in another navy, the loss of one vessel might have sparked panic. Today, it was simply another replacement in a moving ledger of production. The human cost remained real, but the system's design absorbed it. By nightfall, the convoy had reformed, ships steaming steadily toward Liverpool. Observers from the escorting destroyers noted with quiet awe that, despite attacks, the losses were less than 3%. Harper leaned against the railing, feeling the weight of the Atlantic in the rolling waves beneath him. Each ship was a promise, each engine a testament to the labor of thousands in cities and towns across the United States. The fog cleared, revealing the faint lights of the next port of call. Ahead, steel and labor awaited, another wave of ships ready to cross. The war was not only being fought here in the Atlantic, but in every yard, every factory, every hand that hammered rivets or poured molten metal. Harper understood the truth in his bones. Abundance itself had become the deadliest weapon. The convoy's silhouette stretched into the morning sun, unstoppable, immense, a river of steel carrying not just material, but the hope of nations. And somewhere in the Atlantic, the enemy realized that they were not simply facing ships, they were confronting the full weight of an industrial democracy. The first thing Major Thomas Ridley noticed was the smell. Molten steel, burning coal, and oil mixed with the tang of sweat from thousands of workers moving in synchronized chaos. From the mezzanine of the Detroit Arsenal, he could see row upon row of machines shaping the heart of America's armored divisions. Sherman tanks rolled off the assembly lines in a relentless procession, each chassis measured, tested, and welded to exacting specifications. The war in Europe might have raged thousands of miles away, but here, in the hum of hydraulics and stamping presses, the outcome was being forged in steel. Ridley moved past the assembly lines, watching mechanics and engineers as they monitored engines and gun mounts. Each M4 Sherman carried a 75-millimeter gun, capable of piercing the armor of most German tanks, and the armor plating ranged from 50 to 75 millimeters thick. In a single month, this plant could produce more tanks than the Wehrmacht deployed on the Western Front. It was a number so large it seemed impossible, yet it was real. America's industrial democracy was weaponized, and every worker, from the line welder to the quality inspector, understood their role in the grand equation of victory. Overhead cranes lifted turret assemblies, dropping them with mechanical precision onto waiting hulls. Sparks flew, and the sound of metal grinding against metal filled the cavernous space. Ridley paused to speak with a welder, a young woman named Joan Peters, whose forearms bore the permanent stains of labor. "Every bolt counts," she said without looking up, eyes fixed on the seam she was fusing. "If one turret fails in the field, soldiers die. But if I keep up, we give them a chance." Ridley nodded. Here, in human detail, the abstraction of production became intimately tangible. Every tank was not just steel and firepower, but a lifeline for men he would never meet. Meanwhile, inventory clerks tallied parts, engines, tracks, radios, and machine guns. In this one facility alone, over 5,000 components moved daily into assembly, a flowchart of organization that rivaled any military operation. The impossible statistic hovered in the background. This arsenal could produce in a single week what Germany might manage in 2 months under ideal conditions. Ridley watched the logistical ballet, realizing that the Americans were fighting with an abundance that was more decisive than tactics alone. Quantity had become quality. Scale had become a strategic weapon. Engineers tested each tank on rolling hills behind the factory. Turrets rotated smoothly, transmissions shifted without hitch, and the fire control systems passed their calibration. Ridley noted the contrast with reports from the front. German panzers, formidable in design, often suffered from maintenance delays and shortages. Here in Detroit, redundancy eliminated scarcity. Parts were interchangeable, replacements plentiful, and failures expected, but always absorbed. The war was not being won solely by those on the battlefield. It was being orchestrated in the hum of presses, the clang of rivets, and the precise calculations of engineers. At midday, the plant paused briefly as the foreman called for a roll call. Thousands of workers, soldiers temporarily attached to production duties, and civilian engineers assembled in disciplined lines. The foreman spoke in clipped, efficient tones, emphasizing safety, efficiency, and output. Every hour counts, every tank counts. The Allies are counting on this steel. Ridley felt the weight of history pressing down, realizing that these people, in their ordinary labor, were performing extraordinary acts of strategic warfare. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ridley walked along the test track. Smoke from the firing range mingled with the factory exhaust. Sherman after Sherman traversed the terrain, each carrying its human cargo safely toward the front. Each vehicle represented not only technological ingenuity, but an economic and social mobilization of unmatched scale. And in that, Ridley understood the deeper truth. America's arsenal was not merely a collection of weapons. It was a manifestation of democratic society itself, of the collective will to equip, protect, and advance civilization. By evening, the lights of the factory glowed like a city of fire. Workers continued their rhythm, even as fatigue set in. Ridley lingered at the mezzanine, watching the endless procession of tanks ready to depart for ports and convoys. The hum of machinery, the organized chaos, the sheer magnitude of output, all of it pressed into his mind as a single, overwhelming fact. America had created a war-winning machine not just on the battlefield, but at home. And tomorrow, more tanks would roll, more men would be armed, and the arsenal's pulse would continue to echo across oceans, proving that industrial democracy could indeed defeat totalitarian scarcity. Ridley exhaled, imagining those tanks reaching the front lines, transforming numbers on paper into dominance on the ground. The machines below were not just weapons. They were proof that civilization's collective labor could overwhelm oppression. And somewhere beyond the horizon, enemies would feel the weight of this abundance long before they could touch the first armored flank. The first shell that exploded above the Pacific at dawn painted the sky with fire, and Captain Elaine Morrison felt the concussion through her feet as she crouched behind the deck gun. On board the USS Enterprise, sailors scrambled in rehearsed motions, each aware of the split seconds that could mean life or death. Morrison's eyes tracked the incoming Japanese aircraft as her crew adjusted the 40mm Bofors, calibrated to fire at 120 rounds per minute, each shell guided by calculations that combined speed, altitude, and trajectory. The enemy had numbers, yes, but America had something more. Innovation in real time, shaped by industrial abundance and tactical daring. Hours earlier, engineers in distant labs had already resolved the radar interference that had plagued earlier missions. SCR-584 fire control radars, weighing over 2,000 pounds each, now sent precise signals to anti-aircraft guns across the fleet, allowing gunners to hit targets that once seemed untouchable. Morrison, operating her sighting system, marveled at the synchronization. Each shot was informed by thousands of calculations per second, yet her hands executed the commands with a human rhythm honed through practice. It was the intersection of human skill and industrial ingenuity, a dance that transformed steel, electronics, and intuition into overwhelming power. In the engine room, Chief Petty Officer Samuel Ortega monitored turbine output. The Enterprise's propulsion systems pushed 212,000 shaft horsepower through 4 massive turbines, delivering speeds that made interception nearly impossible for enemy bombers. He noted the efficiency of the machinery, built in Detroit and assembled by a workforce that had never seen combat, yet knew they were fighting in every turn of every turbine. The impossible statistic lingered. In 1 week, American shipyards launched more naval vessels than Japan could produce in an entire month. Morrison understood that this advantage was invisible to the enemy until it slammed into them with lethal precision. Back on deck, Morrison's gunners fired in unison as a kamikaze plane dove, leaving a trail of smoke like a malevolent comet. Anti-aircraft shells detonated with bursts of white light, each explosion accompanied by shrapnel dancing through the sky. Every burst represented the culmination of countless innovations: improved fuse timing, better propellant chemistry, and assembly lines that churned out ammunition faster than any human could count. One sailor yelled, "Direct hit!" and Morrison saw the plane break apart, fragments scattering into the ocean. The crew cheered, but she knew the battle was far from over. Innovation, like war itself, was relentless and required constant adaptation. Below decks, the communications center hummed with activity. Operators decrypted signals using newly deployed Sagaba machines, each keystroke peeling back layers of enemy secrecy. Morrison could hear the tap of keys and the low murmur of codebreakers translating numeric sequences into actionable intelligence. This integration of technology and strategy allowed the fleet to anticipate enemy movements, turning potential disasters into controlled encounters. Every innovation, radar, fire control, cryptography, engine design, built upon the previous, creating a cascade effect where industrial capacity translated directly into battlefield dominance. As the day wore on, Morrison watched the results. Waves of enemy aircraft destroyed or driven off. Friendly losses minimal. The impossible statistic seemed real. The ratio of enemy aircraft downed to American casualties in similar encounters exceeded 100 to 1. She felt awe and a grim satisfaction. These were numbers, yes, but they were human lives saved and enemy capacity denied. The innovations she wielded were not abstract tools, but instruments of preservation, designed to tip the balance decisively in America's favor. Evening fell, and the fleet reorganized. Morrison leaned against the rail, exhausted, eyes tracing the last traces of smoke across the horizon. She thought of the factories, the engineers, the thousands who never saw combat but whose labor ensured that each shell, each radar pulse, and each turbine rotation worked flawlessly. The firestorms of innovation had not only destroyed enemy machines, they had redefined what was possible in warfare. Morrison understood that the victory being forged was systemic. It was the product of human ingenuity amplified by industrial power, a testament to what a democracy could achieve when every citizen contributed to a common goal. As stars emerged, reflected in the black water below, Morrison saw the fleet as a constellation of effort, each ship a node in a network of human and mechanical synergy. Tomorrow would bring more attacks, more challenges. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. America's advantage was not luck. It was innovation, speed, and the unyielding capacity to outthink, outproduce, and outfight. And somewhere, across the vast ocean, the enemy would feel the weight of that advantage long before they saw it coming. Dawn broke over the Normandy coast with a gray light that seemed almost cruelly indifferent to the thousands gathering below. Private First Class Henry Lawson adjusted his helmet and gripped his M1 Garand, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hands. Around him, the hum of landing craft engines mixed with the cries of men readying themselves for a mission that would define history. In that moment, the enormity of the operation was almost incomprehensible. Every soldier, every piece of equipment, every supply crate was part of a colossal arithmetic, one where numbers would decide who survived and who fell. Lawson's company, C-14, had spent weeks rehearsing the landing, each maneuver timed to the second. Naval bombardments were designed to soften German defenses, yet intelligence suggested the enemy had fortified every trench and pillbox. The Americans' edge lay not only in training, but in sheer weight of numbers. Over 156,000 troops would land on D-Day, supported by more than 5,000 ships and landing craft. American firepower included 11,000 aircraft providing close support, thousands of tons of explosives delivered with precision. Lawson understood that these figures were more than statistics. They were instruments of survival, a buffer against the lethal efficiency of entrenched defenses. As the Higgins boat lurched over the waves, Lawson noticed the meticulous orchestration of industrial capacity. Every vehicle, every weapon, had been produced in American factories at an unprecedented scale. A single plant in Detroit had manufactured more Sherman tanks in 1 month than Germany could deploy in an entire quarter. The impossible statistic was no exaggeration. America's assembly lines had converted raw steel, labor, and ingenuity into overwhelming force, a flood that would drown even the most disciplined enemy. The numerical advantage was tangible. Manpower multiplied by firepower, logistics, and industrial reliability. Each unit was backed by layers of support few adversaries could hope to match. The first wave hit the beach with the roar of naval guns fading behind them. Lawson fired into German bunkers while dodging incoming rounds, witnessing how American production and innovation combined with individual bravery. Each shell, each bullet, each piece of equipment was the outcome of countless hours of labor far from the front. Engineers, machinists, and assembly line workers had ensured that weapon systems operated flawlessly, that vehicles could traverse sand and shrapnel alike, and that medical supplies reached the wounded with astonishing efficiency. For every German machine gun, there were 10 American rifles, each loaded, maintained, and aimed with deadly precision. Meanwhile, in the command ship hovering offshore, Admiral Nimitz surveyed the chaos with calculated calm. Reports flooded in via encrypted channels, Sagaba machines translating coded messages from the front, radar feeds indicating enemy movements, and statistical updates on troop deployments and casualties. These numbers, organized and interpreted, allowed American commanders to adjust the battle in real time, compensating for weather, terrain, and human unpredictability. The human element was critical, but it was multiplied by the numerical advantage inherent in production and planning. One could lose a platoon but still maintain momentum, because the system was engineered to absorb such losses and continue forward relentlessly. By noon, the beachhead was secured. American casualties were heavy, yet disproportionately low compared to the potential devastation. The impossible ratio, the product of meticulous preparation, tactical innovation, and overwhelming industrial support, was clear. Every German defensive position neutralized came at a fraction of the cost expected if parity alone had existed. Soldiers like Lawson could see, in the aftermath, that their survival was not luck, but arithmetic realized through human endeavor and industrial ingenuity. That evening, Lawson looked across the newly secured dunes, watching the first medical teams treat the wounded. Each step forward had been a coordinated dance of numbers: troops, tanks, artillery, supplies, and aircraft, all moving in harmony. The weight of those numbers carried the promise of liberation, of turning industrial capacity into human survival. Behind the front lines, millions of Americans continued their work, producing, refining, and innovating, ensuring that each soldier was armed, fed, and backed by an unbroken chain of support. As darkness settled over Normandy, the beach glowed with small fires and the distant silhouette of ships returning to the horizon. Lawson felt the pulse of the operation, not just in himself, but in every soldier, machine, and piece of logistics. The numbers had carried the day, but it was the human effort behind them that made them meaningful. The Allied advantage was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, visible, and unassailable. Tomorrow would demand the same discipline, innovation, and courage, yet tonight, for a brief moment, the weight of numbers was the weight of victory. The morning air over the Ruhr Valley carried a bitter tang of smoke and molten metal. Major Thomas Whitaker crouched in the observation bunker of the 9th Air Force, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Beneath him, columns of B-17 flying fortresses threaded the gray clouds, their payloads of bombs precisely timed to strike German factories and transportation hubs. From this height, the valley seemed almost serene, the forests and rivers masking the maelstrom beneath. Yet each factory targeted, each rail line disrupted, was a calculated strike on the enemy's capacity to wage war, a precision choreographed from months of intelligence, mapping, and industrial foresight. Whitaker's role was to translate numbers into action. Intelligence reports estimated that Germany had 85% of its steel production concentrated in 5 major industrial centers. The Americans had determined that neutralizing just 3 of these would reduce German armor production by half within 2 months. Today's sorties would focus on Essen and Dortmund, cities that were both heavily defended and absolutely vital. The calculation was brutal, yet clear. Production capacity dictated combat capability. Destroy the factories, and the tanks, artillery, and ammunition would not exist to oppose them. The impossible statistic surfaced again. More tonnage dropped in a single day than Germany could replace in 6 months. This was industrial warfare made manifest, and Major Whitaker was at its helm. Below, anti-aircraft fire rattled across the landscape. Explosions shook the earth, sending plumes of dust and flame skyward. Whitaker recorded the bomb runs, noting which factories were destroyed, which bridges remained intact, which rail lines would require follow-up strikes. Each hit was a testament to American planning. Norden bomb sites, high-octane aviation fuel, and crews trained to precision. On the ground, soldiers in the U.S. Army's Logistical Corps had coordinated the supply of bombs, maintenance of aircraft, and rotation of crews to maintain relentless pressure. In the distance, German radar stations scrambled to detect the incoming waves, but their reports were already obsolete. American aircraft could fly above and beyond, striking faster than Germany could react. The human element remained critical. Flight crews braced against the shudder of anti-aircraft flak, while gunners tracked invisible targets across a patchwork sky. The stress was immense, yet each man understood his role in the wider system. Private Walter Red Harrison, tail gunner of a B-17, noted the fires blooming below like blossoms of fire, thinking of the men on the ground who had depended on his accuracy. The precision of American bombing was not just technology. It was human initiative amplified by industrial and tactical advantage. When the final run concluded, more than 4,000 tons of explosives had obliterated production lines, yet losses were surprisingly low, a testament to planning and coordination at a scale Germany could scarcely imagine. Whitaker withdrew his binoculars, letting the smoke and chaos drift behind him. The calculations had worked. Germany's capacity to produce Panther and Tiger tanks, artillery, and ammunition had been reduced drastically. The ripple effect was already evident. Frontline reports indicated slower supply, mechanical shortages, and reduced operational tempo. Every bomber, every ton of explosives, every calculation of trajectory translated into the incapacitation of enemy forces. This was the apex of industrially amplified warfare, a demonstration that America's factories, aircraft, and analytical rigor could dictate the pace of battle without ever engaging in hand-to-hand combat. As night fell over the valley, Whitaker contemplated the broader implications. The devastation he had helped orchestrate was not random. It was arithmetic realized, a testament to the union of human courage and industrial might. Tomorrow, other factories, other transport nodes, other cities would face the same relentless scrutiny. Each strike reminded the world that American victory was not luck, but design. precision engineered from factories in Ohio and Pennsylvania to skies over Germany. In that realization, Major Whitaker understood the true power behind the war effort. A nation's productivity, applied with skill and imagination, could achieve what armies alone never could. The sun rose over Washington, D.C., spilling light across the Capitol, the National Mall, and the network of factories still humming across the Midwest. Colonel Margaret Avery walked the halls of the War Department, reviewing reports that traced every bullet fired, every plane built, every ration delivered. The figures were staggering. 297,000 aircraft produced, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million rifles, all within a span of 4 years. These were not abstract numbers, but the building blocks of victory, evidence that industrial democracy had rendered totalitarian methods obsolete. The victory was now quantified, analyzed, and immortalized in charts, photographs, and veteran testimony. Avery reflected on the human stories behind the statistics. Enlisted men in North Africa, engineers in Detroit, and nurses in field hospitals had each contributed to an unprecedented machine of war. Their collective labor translated directly into battlefield outcomes. The German army, formidable in training and discipline, could not match the velocity and scale of American production. 1 hour of American factory output equaled a month of enemy manufacturing. American soldiers and civilians alike had wielded abundance as a weapon, proving that free labor, motivated by civic purpose, could surpass coercive efficiency. Archives and reports demonstrated the broader strategic implications. Logistics, once a supporting factor, had become decisive. Fuel, munitions, and spare parts reached every theater on schedule. Aircraft squadrons could rotate continuously because engines and parts were produced faster than they wore out. Infantry units advanced, knowing artillery support would be waiting, fully supplied. The impossible ratios, 100-to-1 supply advantages, factories outproducing entire enemy nations, were no exaggeration. They were the foundations of modern operational art. Avery noted that these lessons were codified into doctrine, ensuring that future generations would study not only tactics, but the interplay of industry and strategy. In conversations with visiting historians, Avery emphasized the duality of victory: human courage amplified by material abundance. The Normandy beaches, the skies over the Ruhr, the jungles of the Pacific, all demonstrated the same principle. Democracy's industrial power could not merely match, but overwhelm tyranny. The soldiers' eyes, the sweat on assembly line floors, and the keystrokes of logistical planners combined into an inexorable force. The narrative of American victory was inseparable from the narrative of production, innovation, and civic engagement. By mid-afternoon, Avery walked past the Smithsonian exhibits detailing wartime aircraft, tanks, and communication systems. Each display, polished and cataloged, represented thousands of human hours and strategic decisions. Visitors paused, often unaware of the scale behind each artifact. Yet the lesson was unmistakable. American supremacy in war was not inherited. It was constructed through democratic effort, technological ingenuity, and industrial discipline. Civilians and soldiers had become partners in history, their contributions multiplying the impact of every soldier at the front. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Avery gazed toward the Capitol dome, reflecting on the legacy left behind. Victory had been decisive, but its lessons endured. Industrial capacity, civic engagement, and technological innovation had proven that democracy could wage war more effectively than any autocracy relying on oppression and scarcity. The archives, the photographs, and the veterans' accounts would ensure that future generations recognize that the American advantage was not merely numerical. It was ethical, strategic, and structural. The light faded, but the impact remained. The legacy of the arsenal, the triumph of abundance over brutality, and the realization that every civilian and soldier had contributed to a historic victory lingered in the nation's consciousness. As night fell, the story of America's industrial and military prowess stood complete, not merely as history but as a blueprint for how democratic values, combined with human and material resources, could reshape the world.